What's happening, guys? So you might remember that I've been having some issues with my squat depth recently, and I seem to have it figured out now, and I didn't want to do a video too soon because I wanted to give it a couple weeks of actually trying this out to make sure it's going to be fairly consistent before I brought it out, and it does seem like I have it fixed now, knock on wood. So I wanted to kind of go over some of the things that I've done to improve my depth and might actually help you if you have these issues as well. So that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. So usually when you hear about squat depth issues, what's the first thing that always comes to mind? Flexibility, right? Mobility issues. That's what's... I've done videos in the past about flexibility issues with squat depth. There's a lot of information out there, and mobility is always on the forefront. And I think a lot of times it's just not, that's not the case. It's not flexibility that's the issue. It's the way that you're actually going about the squat is trying to make your body do something that it can't do because of your particular anatomy, and you're just fighting that. Especially people with long femurs really have this issue where they want to stay super upright and they can't hit depth by staying upright. Well, that's because with long femurs and a short torso, you're not going to be able to stay upright. You're going to have to fold over to be able to hit depth. So if you're fighting that, you'll never hit depth. Now, that was not my issue. My issue was really simple, and it's almost too simple, but I'm really happy because it seems to be making a big difference. And all I really did to fix my depth was take my toes that they were pointed out a little bit, and I just turned them in. That was it. Now, what that does is it allows me to, for whatever reason, with my hip structure or whatever it is, I'm not here saying that I'm a anatomy expert or anything like that, but there's got to be something with my hip structure that when I turn them in, it just makes it easier for me to sit back and get my knees out. And that's been the big thing. Focusing on pushing out my knees while I'm dropping back makes a huge difference. But until I turn my toes in and widen my stance just slightly, I just wasn't able to get there. It was like borderline all the time, and ever since I made that change, I seem to be burying every single rep. So that's really good for me because USAPL for some reason seems to be getting pickier and pickier and pickier with every single meet with squat depth, so I need to make sure that I'm just bombing depth every single time to make sure when it comes meet time that I don't get red lighted for depth. That would be terrible. Now you might be wondering why I decided to try to turn my toes in and what even brought that to my mind to even try that at all. And it was really because I used to hit depth very easily. When I was a high bar squatter, I just hit depth and it was no issues. I never really even had to think about it at all. I just buried it. But when I made the switch to low bar, and especially when it started getting heavier, that's kind of when it started becoming an issue. And I had to make a couple changes because a high bar squat and a low bar squat, they're not the same movement. And I started getting a lot of knee pain with the low bar squat because I was kind of squatting like it was a high bar, and I had to make some changes. And one of the changes that I did make was to not only widen my stance, but to turn my toes out afterwards. And I did them both. And I think the major issue was actually the narrower stance that I had with my high bar didn't work well for my low bar, and I couldn't get my hips to drop in between my legs properly, and it didn't work. So I had to widen my stance, and when I also turned my toes out at the same time, I think that's what got me. So I had a forward stance with my high bar, so I thought, well, let's try it with low bar, and if I get some knee pain, I'll start going outside again. Well, turned them in, started hitting depth immediately. So that was exciting. Now, what does that mean for you? Well, it doesn't mean that you should start turning in your toes if they're turned out, but it does mean that if you're having issues with it, play around with your stance, play around with your stance width, the way you're pointing your toes. You know, make sure you're dropping your hips back and getting your knees apart. Play around with different things because it doesn't work the same for everybody, and your anatomy and your structure is going to dictate how well you'll be able to get into position, just depending on how you do the movement. So it's not necessarily a flexibility issue. It could be, but it's not always going to be flexibility, and it just might be the way you're trying to squat, and it might not work very well for your anatomy. So just something to keep in mind. So that's all I have for this video. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, and I will see you guys in the next video.